Thanks so much for having me, and this is my first Danyliw seminar. I've been aware of it for many years, but I'm glad to finally be here and be in Ottawa with you all. So where do we go from here? We can't pretend that we're going to face the realities and solve the crisis of where we go from here in a round table at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday evening. But I think actually that something I've been thinking about through all of your presentations this week is it's a reminder that this isn't just a seminar. This is a platform for building Ukrainian studies. And what we're doing here actually contributes to what we need to do in the future, and I'll tell you why in just a sec. So I want to talk about three main points today from my perspective as a historian about how we do research now and what do we do going forward for research, since we probably won't be back in Ukraine for a while, at least most of us won't be. So I first want to talk about myself as a historian and our responsibility to telling narratives about time. I want to talk briefly about this moment of decolonization and post-colonial studies. And I want to finish with some opportunities for how we do research in the future. Now, I'm talking as a historian, so it's based in this way, but I'm also talking as a practitioner in Ukrainian studies, and I think what I have to say will be, I think, useful for all of us in this room. I want to start actually by going back to March of this year when I landed back in Detroit after first being evacuated from Ukraine and then spending some months in Poland working with refugees and doing humanitarian work. I landed in Detroit and went through customs, and it was the first time I didn't get harassed for coming back from Ukraine. They're always interested why you're there. They see your visa, they always have these questions. But instead, the customs agent said something really interesting to me. And she said, "Where are you coming from?" I said, "From Poland." "Where were you before that?" "I was in Ukraine." She goes, "Ukraine." She goes, "Is there something going on over there?" Okay. On a transatlantic flight where I've been sleep deprived, I'd been sleeping in a one-bedroom apartment with friends who had come from Ukraine with a newborn child, the four of us in a one-bedroom apartment for a few months. This was the reality in Poland for those who were there. We were helping who we could. We brought them in. I was tired, and I about lost my mind when she said that. But what it told me, actually, was it said something about the visibility of Ukraine on people's minds in the US. And we heard yesterday potentially about people in Canada as well, although you have a very strong Ukrainian diaspora here that I think keeps things in motion, and that's really great. And we have this in the US in some capacity as well. So when I heard this, I realized that we have a responsibility to have dialogue with these individuals. And it told me not only that Ukraine's not on the mental maps, something that Olesia Hromeychuk has talked about religiously over the past few months, putting Ukraine on people's mental maps. It also made me realize that a lot of people think this war started in February. As a historian, this drives me crazy. I continually remind people that this has been going on for years. Over 8 years now. I don't have the exact number. I was tweeting it every day for a while, but I haven't been doing that. Things inevitably changed on February 24th. I was on the front lines, on the border. I saw what happened. It was a major rupture in our historical thinking, no doubt. And this is a new moment in our historical timeline. But saying that, we need to get people to think about the longer historical arc. And this war has been going on for much longer, and in my opinion, Russian aggression for even longer. And as a historian of famines in the Soviet period, I see a lot of parallels, right? And I'm not saying that we need to read teleologically into what's going on at all. In fact, we have a responsibility not to choreograph the present back onto the past, but to use these moments of the present to go back, reread what we read before, and see what new interpretations come out of this. It's not to say that the past has changed, but to say the way that we're thinking about the past has. And that's exactly what's going on here. This is also going to help people challenge longstanding Russian and Soviet narratives that they've learned over and over in schools. But if we get the time right of the war and invite people back into history, into Ukraine, into Ukrainian history, they're going to start to read history not just from a Russian perspective, from a Soviet perspective, or from even a European perspective where Ukraine is on the periphery, Eastern Europe with a small e. They're going to see a timeline that is Ukraine's. And it's going to invite them to see Ukrainian perspectives in history, Ukrainian historical arcs. And this is, I think, our first responsibility. Now, I want to say a few words about decolonizing history and really the academy more generally. There's been lots of calls for this. It's prompted people to say we need to decolonize Soviet history, Russian history, etc. But what does this mean in practice? How do we do it? And where do we start? Now, as good scholars, we can theorize the hell out of this. What is decolonization? What is post-colonial theory? We can get into this. We should, and we have. But if we want to talk about practicality, which is sort of my whole pedagogy when I'm teaching, is I need to make it clear to students why they should study something, why they should have an invitation to care. I think, to me, the easiest way to put this to an audience that doesn't really need to hear this, I'm preaching to the choir here when I say that we need to put Ukraine in perspective. We need to give Ukraine more space. Simply put, I wrote a piece not too long ago called "We Need to Let Ukraine Speak." What I mean by this is that we need to get Ukraine more substantially into our syllabi, into our colleagues' syllabi, not just into our courses on Ukraine, which many of us, at least in the US, are not privileged enough to just be able to teach a whole course on Ukraine. That's just not the luxury we have. We teach all sorts of survey courses, and Soviet history courses is as close as most of us get. But there are ways to include Ukraine into these syllabi, into European history. I always talk about it in my European classes. I'm teaching a class on Europe and the world. My students asked me, when are we going to talk about the war? They want it now. I have to remind them, we're still just finishing the French Revolution, but we'll get there, okay? But they're asking for it. There is demand. I'm also teaching a course on transitional justice, historical transitional justice right now. I think that, in fact, this war is going to bring in a lot of transitional justice histories and studies into this perspective, and Ukraine, in fact, will shape that field, inevitably, no doubt. We also need to have conversations with our colleagues and get them to start talking about Ukraine. It's one thing for us to do it, but it's another thing for our colleagues to also start talking about Ukraine, and we need to help them with that. I have a lot of folks that reached out to me after writing certain things and said, I found this reading valuable, or do you have any recommendations for this? I try and send inquiries that I get that I don't know how to answer to my colleagues, to you. Some of you have probably gotten emails from me saying, can you please help them? But we need to help develop the academy in this way. It puts pressure on us, but we need to do it. I also think that the war has made sure that we're inviting Ukrainian scholars more substantially into our conversations. This is something I think we do regularly. The call for fellowships was astounding for Ukrainians to go all over the world. But this is temporary. And this is what I worry about. Interest is diminishing already in the war, whether we like it or not, from international audiences. Those of us who really care will be in it for the long run, and we have. But outsiders who are challenged with our own domestic problems, we have elections coming up, these types of things, there are other things to worry about. But it's our responsibility to keep Ukraine on people's mental maps. And I will reiterate this until I die. We also need to start bringing in Ukrainian scholars just regularly into our classes. This is something I like to do. I hope others are doing this. Students need to hear from Ukrainians themselves. They need to hear about what's happening from Ukrainians, their narratives, not my narratives. It's one thing for me to teach them. It's another thing for them to hear actually from Ukrainian scholars and read their works. And so I know there's a lot of efforts going on with translations right now of Ukrainian books into English, which will really help with this. Which is a whole other topic of why we need Ukrainian language in schools as well. But that's not something I have time to get into now. So let me move forward just with my limited time here to talk about how we do research now. So I was working in Ukraine, I was living in the capital in Kyiv, and I was doing research in the archives like a historian does, cutting my teeth, as they say. I don't have this luxury. My research year was interrupted, my Fulbright year over dramatically. And people are asking, how do we do this? I've seen some articles that I disagree with that say now is the time to go visit Ukraine. There have been calls for war tourism. There are articles written by academics. This is problematic, and we need to have this conversation about morals and ethics of research, which is something that I know that Natalia and I are both interested in. I refuse to go back to Ukraine right now and do archival research because that's not important right now. If I'm going back to Ukraine, it's to help on a humanitarian front or something like that. I'm not going to put others in danger. We have an ethical and moral responsibility to look out for Ukraine. Ukraine, for me, I am not of Ukrainian background, and people always assume I am because I study Ukraine. But I have a responsibility to Ukraine as a scholar. It's given me its history, it's lent me its ears. People have had conversations with me. I consider Ukraine my second home in many ways. In fact, I'm still a temporary resident for a couple more years because the war, ousted me before I had to hand back my Vsetecka, but don't tell the government. It is my second home. So my responsibility now is to help people understand Ukraine and help people get interested in studying Ukraine. That is my role as a scholar. That being said, there are moments of hope here that I want to talk about. So doing research doesn't mean that we're cut off because we can't go to Ukraine. In fact, we're very privileged to be in Canada and the United States with Ukrainian collections that are massive. We have Ukrainian museums all over. I've spent time in Cleveland, with Andy Fedensky, who runs the Cleveland Museum, and they have a beautiful basement of chaotic shelves full of wonderful Ukrainian resources that need to be discovered. We have the Shevchenko Society. We have Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. We have digital sources now, the Liberation Movement Archive, the Electronic Archive. We have Libraria, which is a beautiful collection of Ukrainian newspapers. That's just the start. Our universities also have archives, and they are full of Ukrainian materials, I promise you. I was at the University of Minnesota a couple of years ago and accidentally stumbled into a Ukrainian collection that was beyond my imagination. Go to the archives in the US and Canada. They have things. I know they do. I want to finish with this. We also have oral histories. Natalia and Anna and others who are doing this work of collecting these are other important sources. Now, I think there's opportunities to create oral histories of your own, but you need to be careful. You need to be sensitive. As a scholar of trauma, please don't re-traumatize people. Because if you remember this, if you take one thing from this talk, it's that people are traumatized now. And what trauma really means is the interjection of the past into the present. It's with us. The things that have happened are here and prohibiting us from moving forward. But we should use the documentation that exists. What you're doing is not in vain. You're creating evidence too. Scholars will use this. And I will finish with this, and we can have a conversation, I hope, about long-term sustainability of Ukrainian studies, which I don't have time to talk about. But right now, where do we go from here? We continue to build. Ukrainian studies is building while Russia destroys. And that's a marker of difference. And we continue to build. So that's where we'll go from here. Thanks.